Have you ever sat in a room full of people, smiling for someone you love, while your chest is quietly collapsing because you just realized you're not even being seen anymore? Have you ever spent years trying to be a good father, working, providing, staying steady, only to hear your own son publicly give the title Dad to another man while you're sitting right there with a glass in your hand? And what would you do if the one thing you feared your whole life finally happened in a single sentence? Your son looked past you, raised a toast, and called someone else the father figure I always needed. Because that's the fear nobody talks about when you're a father. It's not just dying alone, it's dying while you're still alive. Watching your own child rewrite your entire life into a story where you were the background noise and someone else gets credited as the hero. I didn't go to my son's housewarming party expecting a medal. I wasn't there to be praised. I just wanted to feel included. To stand in his new home and think, I helped build the man who built this. I wanted one clean moment where all the years of overtime, the missed sleep, the scraped knuckles, the silent worry meant something to him. Not in a dramatic way, just in the way a son looks at his father when he still feels the connection. But the second I walked in, I could feel it. That subtle temperature shift you notice when you're tolerated, not welcomed. The polite smiles that don't reach anyone's eyes, the way people greet you like you're a family detail, not the foundation. And the worst part wasn't the guests, it was him, my son. He hugged me quickly, thanked me for coming, accepted my gift like it was another item on a table, and then drifted away, towards his friends, towards his colleagues, towards the man he kept laughing with like he was the center of the room. Have you ever watched your own child light up for someone else in a way he never lights up for you? It's a particular kind of pain because you can't even accuse him of anything without sounding pathetic. You're the parent. You're supposed to be proud. You're supposed to be above needing reassurance. So you swallow it. You stand there, you keep your face calm, and you tell yourself, this is still my son. This still matters. Then the toast happened. They clinked glasses. The room quieted. My son stood up, smiling, looking confident in a way I'd always dreamed he would. And as he started thanking people, friends, co-workers, everyone who made him feel important, I relaxed for half a second, thinking maybe he'd say something small about me, just a line, just enough to let me breathe. Then he lifted his glass towards his mentor, Gerald, and said, "Gerald is the father figure I always needed. I owe everything to him." He didn't even look at me when he said that. Not once. And in that moment, I felt every insecurity I've ever had as a father rise up like it had been waiting its whole life for this exact room. Maybe I worked too much. Maybe I wasn't soft enough. Maybe I didn't say the right words when he was little. Maybe I wasn't the kind of dad people post about. Maybe I was just the man who paid bills and stayed tired and assumed love would be understood without being performed. And the room reacted the way rooms do when something uncomfortable gets said in a cheerful place. A few people laughed awkwardly, some clapped too fast, some looked down at their drinks. Gerald smiled that smooth, practiced smile of a man who knows how to receive public praise. And my son kept smiling, like he had just said something beautiful, like he had just honored the right man. Have you ever been humiliated so quietly that you can't even defend yourself without ruining someone else's celebration? That was me. Sitting there, holding the same glass, trying to keep my face from changing, trying to keep my hands steady, trying to keep my pride from turning into something ugly. Because the truth is, I wasn't angry first. I was ashamed. Ashamed that I still wanted to be chosen. Ashamed that I still hoped, after all these years, that he would see me without me having to beg to be seen. And here's the part that makes this story different. I didn't stand up and make a scene. I didn't confront him in front of everyone. I didn't pull my son into a corner and demand an apology, because what would that have solved? You can't argue someone into loving you correctly.
You can't shame someone into remembering what they've already decided to forget. So, I did something else. I left the party. And before I walked out of that perfect new house, I placed one envelope where I knew only my son would find it. Have you ever wanted to tell someone the truth so badly, but you knew if you said it out loud, they'd only hear it as bitterness? That envelope was the only way I could do it without being turned into the villain of his big night. Because what I put inside wasn't a threat, it wasn't begging, it was proof. And it was the kind of proof that doesn't just change a conversation, it changes a life. When my son opened that envelope later that night, his perfect housewarming glow disappeared, and the life he thought was so solid started to shake.
I need to tell you who I was before that toast. Because if you don't know the kind of father I've been, you might think I was just being sensitive. Like maybe I deserved to be replaced. Like maybe I'm one of those men who wants credit for the bare minimum and can't handle his son growing up. But that's not what this was. This was the final crack in a story I've been holding together with my hands for decades, even when my son stopped noticing the bruises on them. My son, Evan, is 34 now. I'm 61, and I raised him mostly alone after his mother left when he was 6. People love to ask why, like it matters more than what happens after. The truth is, she didn't leave with screaming and headlines. She left with a suitcase and a calm voice and a sentence that still makes my stomach tighten if I replay it too long. I can't do this anymore. That was it. No war, no dramatic confession, just a quiet exit. And suddenly I was standing in a small rented house looking at a little boy who couldn't understand why his mother's pillow was gone. Have you ever watched a child try to be brave because it thinks it might make the adult stay? That was my son that first week. Quiet, helpful, too well behaved, like he was trying to earn stability with good manners. And that broke something in me. Because right then I realized I didn't have the luxury of collapsing, not as a man, not as a father, not when he was watching me like I was the only wall left standing. I'm not going to pretend I was perfect. I wasn't. I was tired all the time. I worked too much. I didn't talk about feelings well. I didn't know how to sit on the edge of a bed and say the warm, healing sentences good fathers are supposed to say. I could fix a leaky pipe at midnight. I could keep the lights on, I could pack lunches and uniforms and show up to parent-teacher conferences with a serious face. But when it came to emotional language, I was clumsy. I thought love was something you proved with consistency, not something you performed with words. And maybe that was my first mistake. Because children, especially children who have been abandoned by one parent, don't only need the roof. They need to hear that they're safe under it. They need softness, not just structure. I didn't understand that in the right way until later, and by then some distance had already formed between what I gave and what he remembered receiving. Still, I stayed. That's the part nobody can rewrite, no matter how polished another man appears later. I stayed through the school years where he'd get sick and I'd sit up counting his breaths. I stayed through the mornings when I had to leave for work before the sun came up, and I'd check his forehead one last time, like my hand could protect him from the world. I stayed through the awkward teenage years when he stopped hugging me and started acting like everything I did was embarrassing. I stayed when money was tight and the truck kept breaking down, and I was too proud to ask for help. I stayed when he wanted to join sports, and I didn't have extra for gear and fees, so I took extra shifts and told him it was nothing. I stayed in all the unglamorous ways that don't look impressive to strangers, but keep a child alive inside himself. And he did grow up. He grew up smart, ambitious, hungry for a life bigger than the one I could give him. I was proud of that hunger and afraid of it at the same time. Proud because he deserved more. Afraid because I could see, even early on, that he was also hungry for something else. Approval from men he considered impressive, men who looked like success, men who spoke smooth, men who knew how to walk into a room and make people lean in. That hunger isn't evil, it's human. But in my son, it came wrapped in a quiet shame about where he came from, about me, about the father who smelled like sweat and engine grease and long work days, about the man who didn't know how to make life look pretty. Have you ever felt your child trying to climb out of your life, like it was something he needed to outgrow to be respected? That's how it started to feel when Evan went to college. He didn't become cruel, not at first. He just became distant, efficient. He'd call, but not long. He'd visit, but he'd keep checking his phone. He'd ask if I needed anything, but it sounded like a task, not a tenderness. And every time he came home, he seemed more polished, more certain, more impatient with anything that reminded him of the slower, heavier world I still lived in. I told myself it was normal, that young men do that it's good he was building his own life. I didn't want to be the kind of father who clings, so I stayed in my lane. I kept sending a little money when I could. I kept showing up to graduations. I kept clapping the loudest even when I felt small in the crowd. I kept doing what I knew how to do, support without asking to be witnessed for it. But inside, the fear grew quietly anyway. The fear that one day he would become so successful, so surrounded by impressive people, that he would start seeing his own father as something he had survived, rather than someone who loved him. And then Gerald appeared. Gerald was the mentor, the man Evan met at work after he landed his first real job. Older, wealthy, charismatic. The kind of man who speaks like he has never doubted himself a day in his life. Gerald took Evan under his wing, and at first I was grateful, truly. I thought, good, somebody is guiding him. Somebody is opening doors. Somebody is giving him opportunities I never could. I told myself not to be threatened by it, because why would I be? A good father wants his son to have more, not less. But then I started noticing how Evan talked about him. Not like a boss, not even like a respected mentor, like a hero. Evan's voice would change when he said Gerald's name. He'd get warmer, more animated. He'd quote Gerald's advice like scripture. Gerald says you have to think bigger. Gerald told me never to settle. Gerald thinks I'm going places. And I'd sit there listening, proud of my son's momentum, but feeling this quiet ache because I realized he was receiving something from Gerald that I had never been able to give him in a way he recognized. Admiration delivered in the exact language he wanted to hear. Evan started inviting Gerald into personal spaces too. Dinner outings, celebrations, new milestones. And at first I kept telling myself it was fine. People have mentors. People build chosen families. That's normal. But then came the little comparisons, the subtle ones. Evan would say things like, Gerald is really good at talking about feelings, or Gerald is always calm, or Gerald knows how to handle people. He didn't say, unlike you, Dad. He didn't have to. The contrast sat in the room anyway. And the more Gerald became the center of Evan's adult admiration, the more I felt myself becoming background. Not because Evan hated me, because Evan had learned to value what was impressive over what was faithful. He had learned to respond to polish more than presence. And I don't fully blame him for that, because the world teaches young men that the fathers worth celebrating are the ones who look powerful, not the ones who quietly work themselves into the ground to keep a child safe through abandonment. The world loves a glamorous savior story. It doesn't know what to do with a tired man who stayed. And here's the part I didn't tell anyone for a long time. I started worrying about Gerald, not because he was successful, because he was too interested, too involved, too present in ways that didn't feel clean. I had been around enough men in my life to recognize when generosity comes with strings disguised as guidance. Gerald asked Evan to help with projects outside normal work, introduced him to people who seemed impressed by him a little too quickly, positioned himself in Evan's life like someone who wanted Evan's loyalty, not just his success. I didn't have proof of anything yet back then, just instincts. And in families, instincts are the first thing people teach fathers like me to ignore. Don't be jealous, don't be old-fashioned, don't be insecure. Let the boy have his support. So I swallowed my discomfort like I had swallowed 1,000 other things, and tried to be happy for him anyway. When Evan told me he bought his first house, I was proud enough to cry privately before I even left for the housewarming. I bought a gift that was generous for me, more than I should have spent, and I wrapped it carefully, like wrapping it carefully could somehow wrap my heart too. I told myself this was a chance
a new chapter, a moment where a son and father stand together and the past doesn't need to be argued about. I wanted to walk through his new home and feel something shift back into place. I wanted to believe that no matter who mentored him, no matter who impressed him, when it came down to it, I was still his father in the way that mattered. And that's why the toast wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating. Because it didn't happen in a fight, it happened in celebration, in front of witnesses, in the one moment I thought might finally be simple. And what he said next didn't just bruise my pride, it confirmed the fear I had been carrying quietly since the day his mother walked out, that I could stay, sacrifice, and survive for my son, and still be replaced in his heart by someone who arrived later with nicer words.
By the time the housewarming party really got going, I was already tired in a way that had nothing to do with my age. I was tired from trying to stand in a room where my own son's life seemed to have no space carved out for me unless I stayed quiet enough to not cast a shadow. Evan's new place was beautiful, I'll give him that. Bright kitchen, clean lines, big windows, the kind of home that smells like fresh paint and new beginnings. People were complimenting him, laughing loud, clinking glasses, walking around like the house itself was proof he'd made it. And I stood near the edge holding my gift bag like a man holding a question he didn't know how to ask without making everyone uncomfortable. You learn something strange as a father when your child becomes an adult. There are certain rooms you enter where you realize you've become optional. Not unwanted, just not necessary. Evan introduced me to a few coworkers with quick sentences that sounded polite but rushed, like he was checking a box. This is my dad. No story attached, no warmth, no pride, just the label. Then he turned immediately back to Gerald, back to the people who made him feel impressive. I don't think he meant to hurt me in that moment. That's what makes it worse. It wasn't malice, it was indifference, wearing a smile. And Gerald, he played his role perfectly. He shook my hand with that firm grip men use to establish dominance without being openly rude. He called me sir in a tone that sounded respectful, but somehow still placed me under him, like I was a relic being honored, not a father being respected. He laughed at Evan's jokes, put his hand on Evan's shoulder in a way that looked affectionate, but felt territorial if you knew what to watch for. And Evan soaked it up. He looked at Gerald the way some sons look at fathers when they want approval. Not the kind of approval that says, I love you, the kind that says, I'm worthy of your world. That's what I couldn't stop noticing. Evan wasn't just grateful to Gerald, he was hungry for him, hungry for whatever Gerald represented. Status, polish, power, ease. And every time I saw that hunger, something in me tightened, because I knew how dangerous hunger can be when the wrong person knows how to feed it. There was a moment early in the night when Evan's friends started telling stories. College stories, work stories, the funny kind that make you realize your child now has a whole life you weren't present for. I tried to laugh when it made sense. I tried to look relaxed, but I kept getting that feeling I used to get at parent-teacher nights when I was the only dad sitting alone, trying not to look like the missing half of a family. Like I was always one question away from being exposed as not enough. Not enough warmth, not enough money, not enough softness, not enough time, not enough presence. And that fear, being revealed as the father who did his best and still came up short, sat in my chest the entire evening like a stone. Evan finally came over to me near the kitchen and asked me if I was okay. The question sounded kind, but his eyes didn't stay long enough for it to feel like real concern. It felt like he was checking his conscience. I told him I was fine. That's what fathers do, right? We say we're fine even when we're not because we don't want to make ourselves a burden. He nodded, relieved, and turned away again, just like that, like the moment had been handled. Then came someone called for a toast.
You could feel the room gather around that moment the way people gather around a performance. Everyone got quieter, glasses raised, phones half lifted for pictures. Evan stood near the center, and for a second I felt a flicker of hope I hated myself for feeling, the kind of hope that makes you stupid for one last moment. Maybe he'll say something. Maybe he'll look at me. Maybe he'll acknowledge that behind this house, behind this success, behind this night, there were years when it was just him and me, and I held the line alone. Evan started with the safe things. Thanked his friends for coming, thanked his coworkers for supporting him, thanked everyone who believed in me. People laughed and clapped. Then he said he wanted to thank someone special. He turned toward Gerald with this open smile that I realized I had not seen him give me in years, not since he was a kid and didn't know how to hide his needs yet. And then he said it, word for word, clear as a bell. Gerald is the father figure I always needed. I owe everything to him. I felt my body go rigid like I'd been struck. Not because I didn't understand, because I understood too fast. Too completely. The sentence entered me and immediately rearranged the past. Every overtime shift, every time I missed a school event because the lights had to stay on, every night I sat in a quiet house pretending I wasn't lonely so my son could feel safe, every time I swallowed my own grief about his mother leaving so he wouldn't have to carry it. All of it suddenly felt like a story being rewritten in front of witnesses as if it had never counted. Evan did not look at me when he said it. That's the detail that haunts me. Not once. If he had looked at me, even for half a second, the room might have softened. Someone might have felt the cruelty of the moment and tried to redirect it. But he didn't. His gaze stayed locked on Gerald, like he was presenting a gift to the man he most wanted to impress. And Gerald received it like he was used to being crowned. He lifted his glass with that small, satisfied smile of a man who knows how to accept someone else's longing without ever admitting the appetite he has for it. I don't know what my face looked like then. I wondered. I tried to keep it still. I tried to keep the hurt from changing my expression into something people could interpret as jealousy or bitterness, because that's what happens to men like me. If we show pain, we're petty. If we show anger, we're unstable. If we show sadness, we're weak. So I did what I always did. I kept my face calm and took the hit quietly, while the room applauded a sentence that felt like someone had reached into my chest and pulled something out in front of everyone. People clapped. Some laughed awkwardly, like they felt something was off, but didn't want to be the one to name it. Someone muttered, "That's beautiful." Beautiful. I remember thinking, beautiful for who? Because it didn't feel beautiful to be erased in a toast. It didn't feel beautiful to watch my son offer the highest emotional title he could find to a man he met as an adult, while the father who raised him sat there holding a glass like a prop. Evan kept talking after that, praising Gerald, saying he changed my life, saying he showed me what a real man looks like, and every word felt like another nail. Not because I didn't want Evan to have support, because Evan was speaking as if Gerald had saved him from something, and the something, without being named, was me. My ordinariness, my clumsy love, my tiredness, my not polish. He was telling the room in his own way that what I gave him wasn't the fatherhood he needed, that he had found it somewhere else, and he was doing it on the one night I had shown up trying to celebrate him with my whole heart. How do you respond to that without making it worse? How do you stand up and say, actually, I was here, I stayed, I sacrificed, without sounding like you're begging for a child's validation? How do you defend your own fatherhood in front of strangers without turning your son's housewarming into a scene? There was no good answer. And that's why the moment was so cruel, because it trapped me. It made my pain private and my silence look like acceptance. It made Gerald look generous and me look irrelevant. It gave everyone in the room a clean story to applaud while the messy truth sat in my throat like a stone. Then came the part nobody noticed but me. While the applause faded and conversation restarted, Gerald leaned slightly towards Evan and said something I couldn't fully hear, but I saw Evan's face change, not into guilt, into that eager attentiveness again, like a boy receiving a father's approval. That's when the instinct I'd been swallowing all night rose up hard. Not jealousy, alarm. Because whatever Gerald said, it wasn't just comfort, it looked like instruction. And I realized with a coldness that sobered me instantly that my son wasn't only praising Gerald, he was trusting him deeply. The kind of trust that makes young men sign things, agree to things, follow advice without asking what it costs. And that's when my mind snapped into a different focus. Because humiliation is one kind of pain. Watching your child be used is another. And in that moment, something in me decided that even if Evan didn't want me as his emotional father anymore, I was not going to let him be prey. Not while I was still breathing. Not while I had one more way to protect him. That's why I didn't confront him at the party. Not because I couldn't, because I needed to choose the battleground that actually mattered. Evan's toast was public, his hunger was public, Gerald's smile was public, and if I challenged it publicly, I would become exactly what Evan would expect me to be, the bitter old man jealous of the mentor. Gerald would play calm, Evan would play embarrassed. The room would side with the polished man, and my warning would land like resentment instead of truth. So I stayed quiet. I waited. I watched. Evan went back to entertaining. Gerald went back to shining. People moved through the house like the night was still perfect, and I sat there realizing something awful and useful at the same time. My son was so desperate to believe in Gerald that he would probably reject any warning I spoke out loud, unless I could put proof in his hands in a way he couldn't interrupt with pride. That's why I left, quietly. Without a scene. I found my coat, I nodded to a couple of guests, I let Evan stay busy so he wouldn't follow me out in house and force a conversation in a hallway full of ears, and before I stepped over the threshold of that beautiful home, I placed one envelope where I knew Evan would find later, when the music was...
Because inside that envelope was the only thing stronger than a toast: proof. And the moment Evan opened it, he was going to learn the difference between a man who wanted to be called father and a man who had been one, even when it didn't come with applause. What nobody at that party knew, what my son definitely didn't know, is that I didn't walk into his housewarming empty-handed emotionally. I walked in carrying something heavier than the gift bag in my palm. I walked in carrying a truth I had been sitting on for weeks, a truth I didn't want to believe at first, because it made me sound like exactly what Evan already assumed I was, an old man threatened by a polished mentor. But the truth wasn't about my pride. It was about my son's safety. And once you're a father, real fatherhood doesn't stop just because your child becomes old enough to reject it. If anything, it gets harder. Because now the dangers aren't scraped knees and bad influences you can see from across a schoolyard. Now the dangers wear suits. They speak in measured tones. They call themselves mentors. They offer opportunity with one hand while quietly tying knots. It started about 6 weeks before the housewarming, when Evan called me one evening with a voice that sounded excited and stressed at the same time. He said Gerald had brought him into something big, a private investment opportunity, a partnership, a chance to be part of a deal that would change everything. Evan was glowing through the phone, the way he used to glow when he was a kid and came home with a trophy. He said things like, "Gerald doesn't do this for just anyone. He believes in me. He's treating me like family." And I remember gripping the edge of my kitchen counter hard enough my fingers hurt, because that sentence, treating me like family, made my stomach drop. Not because I didn't want Evan to be valued, because I knew how dangerous it is when a man like Gerald starts using family language in a professional relationship. Family is a word people use when they want loyalty without safeguards, when they want someone to say yes before they ask what the documents say. I asked Evan simple questions. What exactly is it? What are you signing? What's your risk? He laughed like I was being paranoid and said I wouldn't understand. That's another thing that happens between fathers and sons once the son starts climbing social ladders. The father becomes simple in the son's mind, useful for childhood memories, not for adult strategy.
Evan told me Gerald had lawyers, accountants, real people. He told me it was all clean and that I should stop worrying. Then he said something that sounded like a joke, but hit like a warning. Dad, you're always waiting for the catch. Gerald doesn't think like that. And I remember thinking, that's exactly how I know there's a catch. I didn't argue with him on the phone. If I had, he would have heard my concern as jealousy, and Gerald's name was already too sacred in his mouth for my voice to compete with it. So I did what I've always done, when words were too clumsy to carry what I meant. I got quiet. I asked one more question, softly, as if I was just being a father trying to learn. Can you send me the paperwork? I just want to see what you're excited about. Evan hesitated. Then he said he'd send something later. He didn't. 2 days after that, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years at a Home Depot, a man named Cliff. We'd both done some work on the same job sites back when my knees still behaved. We got to talking, the way older men do, small talk that drifts into real life before you notice it. Cliff asked how my son was doing. I told him Evan was doing well, bought a house, had a big mentor at work helping him rise. Cliff's face changed when I said Gerald's name. Not dramatically, just enough. A tiny tightening at the corners of his mouth, the kind of reaction men have when they're trying to decide whether to warn you or stay out of it. Gerald West? He asked. I said yes. Cliff looked at the floor for a second and then said, "Careful with that man. He's smooth. People think he's generous until they realize what they signed." That was it. One sentence, but it hit me like cold water, because it confirmed the thing my instincts had been whispering for months. Gerald didn't just have influence, he had a pattern. I asked Cliff what he meant, and Cliff kept his voice low like he didn't want the air itself to overhear it. He said Gerald had been involved in a few situations. Young professionals pulled into deals they didn't fully understand. Risk shifted onto the youngest name on the paperwork. Promises made verbally that didn't match what was written. People trapped by pride because once they praised Gerald publicly, they were too embarrassed to admit they'd been used. Cliff didn't have every detail, but he had enough to make one thing clear. Gerald knew exactly how to make ambitious young men feel chosen, and then he used that feeling to get signatures. Have you ever had a moment when the fear you didn't want to name finally gets a witness? That was mine. My stomach sank because I could already see how this would play out with Evan. Evan was hungry. Evan was loyal. Evan wanted a father figure so bad he would accept the wrong man's grip around his shoulder as love. I went home and did what my son never believed I could do. Research. Quietly. Patiently. I'm not a lawyer, but I've lived long enough to know that most perfect men leave trails. Civil filings, business registrations, public records, complaints, news blurbs buried deep. I started with his name and worked outward. Company structures, shell entities, partnerships that dissolved quickly, a lawsuit that ended with a quiet settlement with a confidentiality clause, which told me more than any verdict ever could. LinkedIn connections that looked too carefully curated. And one thing that kept repeating, Gerald's deals always seemed to end with him protected and someone younger carrying the bruises. Then I found the first real red flag tied directly to Evan, a filing that showed a new LLC registered 2 months earlier with Evan's name attached, not as a minor consultant, not as an employee, as a managing member, the kind of role that comes with responsibility, liability, exposure, the kind of role you don't step into without understanding exactly what's being placed on your shoulders. My son hadn't told me that, which meant either he didn't understand what he'd signed, or he did understand and didn't want me to see it. I called Evan again and tried a different approach. Not warning, not accusing, curiosity. I asked him how things were going with the deal. He said great. He sounded almost rehearsed. I asked whether he'd signed anything yet. He said just standard forms. Standard. That word again. The word people use when they want you to stop asking questions because questions make their confidence wobble. I asked him directly, "Are you listed as a managing member on anything?" He went quiet for half a second and then laughed like I was ridiculous. "Dad, why are you Googling me?" he said. That laugh told me everything. Not because he was guilty, because he was defensive. And defensiveness is what you hear when someone's pride is trying to protect them from admitting they might be over their head. I realized then I wouldn't get the documents from him willingly. Not because he wanted to hide from me necessarily, but admitting the need for my help would mean admitting Gerald might not be the hero he'd been praising publicly. And once a man builds his identity around another man's approval, he will protect that identity like it's oxygen. So I went around him. I contacted a woman I'd done a small renovation job for years earlier, whose husband worked in compliance at a financial firm. I didn't tell her the whole story. I asked for a favor. I asked for someone to look at the structure of an LLC and tell me in plain language what kind of exposure my son might be stepping into if he was listed the way he was. That man, the compliance guy, looked at what I had found publicly and told me something that made my blood cold. If your son is the managing member and the money moves wrong, he's the first name everyone will come for, he said. He's the one who will look like the responsible party, even if he doesn't control the real decisions. In other words, Evan wasn't being mentored, he was being positioned. And that's when I understood what the envelope had to be. It couldn't just be my feelings. It couldn't be a father's wounded letter about being overlooked. Evan would read that as bitterness and close his heart out of pride. No, the envelope had to contain two things: proof of Gerald's pattern and proof of my love. Evidence and truth, something Evan couldn't dismiss as jealousy without dismissing paper itself. So I started gathering what I could: public filings, corporate registrations, timelines, a printout of the LLC showing Evan's role, copies of the lawsuit entries that hinted at Gerald's past without requiring Evan to take my word for it. And then, on top of the documents, I wrote my own letter. Not a long one, not a dramatic one, the kind of letter a man writes when he knows he only gets one chance to be heard before pride closes the door. I kept it simple because complicated words were never my strength. I wrote things like, "I am sorry I wasn't the father you wanted. I am sorry I didn't know how to speak softly when you needed softness. I am sorry you grew up feeling like you needed another man to show you how to be a man." But I also wrote the part I needed him to understand more than anything. I will not watch you be used because you are hungry for a father figure. I will not lose you to a man who knows how to sound like love while building a trap. If you're angry at me for this, be angry later. Read first. And I sealed it.
I didn't plan to bring it to the housewarming. I swear I didn't. I thought I would find the right moment another day. A quieter day. A day when Evan wasn't surrounded by guests and pride and celebration. But then the toast happened. Then Evan raised his glass and crowned Gerald in public as the father he always needed. And then he did it without looking at me once in the room, like my presence in the room didn't require any acknowledgement at all. And in that moment, I understood something with brutal clarity. There would never be a right time to tell Evan the truth if the truth threatened the fantasy he'd built around Gerald. There would only be times when I was brave enough to place the truth in his hands, and times when I wasn't. So, I became brave. Not loud brave, quiet brave. That's what the envelope was. It wasn't revenge for the toast. It was protection in its final form, because I knew something Evan didn't yet. Men like Gerald don't just take your money. They take your agency, they take your name, they take your future, and leave you holding the liability while they walk away looking generous. And if that happened to Evan, it wouldn't just destroy his finances, it would destroy his identity. It would destroy the very pride he was using to reject me. That's why I left without a scene.
I couldn't compete with Gerald in the room where Gerald was being celebrated. I had to let the paper speak in the quiet after the music ended. I had to let the evidence do what my words could not. I had to give Evan a moment alone with the truth, away from applause and posturing and the beautiful lie of a mentor who looks like a savior. And I knew the second he opened that envelope, either he would throw it away and choose the fantasy anyway, or he would read far enough to realize the man he toasted might not be the father he needed at all. Either way, the night wouldn't stay perfect for long.
I left the housewarming party the way men like me leave places when we're bleeding but don't want anyone to see it. Quietly. No slammed doors, no angry goodbyes, no walking back into the room to demand an apology and turn my son's celebration into a courtroom. I put my coat on. I nodded at a couple of guests who looked at me with that quick, uncertain expression people get when they sense something is wrong but don't want to be responsible for naming it. I stepped outside into the cold night air, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe without performing calm for anybody. My truck was parked under a streetlight a couple houses down. I walked to it slowly, not because my body couldn't move faster, but because my mind was still trying to decide what kind of pain I was holding. Humiliation is one kind. Fear is another. Love mixed with fear is the worst one, because it makes you want to run back inside and protect your son, and also makes you want to disappear forever so you never have to be looked through again. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The house looked warm from the outside. Windows glowing, shadows moving, laughter spilling through the walls. My son's new life, his new people, his new father figure. And inside that warmth, I knew a man with a smooth smile was tightening a knot around Evan's future, while Evan was too hungry for approval to feel the rope. I wanted to drive away and never come back. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. There is a point where being rejected by your own child makes you want to protect what little dignity you have left by removing yourself entirely. But then my mind went to the LLC document. My son's name listed as managing member, the lawsuits, the pattern, the way Gerald positioned himself, the way Evan looked at him during that toast like a boy asking to be claimed. And I understood something clearly. If I drove away and stayed silent, I wouldn't just be a father who got replaced. I would be a father who watched his son fall into a trap and did nothing because his pride was bruised. That wasn't going to be my story. Not after everything. Not after staying all those years when it would have been easier to leave. Not after holding my son through the kind of abandonment that should have taught him the value of truth instead of the hunger for polished men. So, I did the only thing left that still felt like fatherhood. I went back. Not back into the party, back to the threshold. I walked up to the front door while music played inside. I didn't knock. I didn't ring. I didn't want Evan coming to the door and forcing a conversation right then with Gerald and guests nearby, because I knew exactly how that would go. Evan would be embarrassed, Gerald would be calm, Evan's pride would flare, and the message would bounce off him before it ever landed. So, I slid the envelope through the mail slot. Heavy envelope, manila. My son's name handwritten on the front in block letters because I wanted it to look serious enough that he wouldn't toss it aside with the junk mail. I hesitated for a second with my fingers still touching the edge of it. I remember the exact thought that hit me in that moment. Once he reads this, he will never see the night the same way again. And that made me sad because I didn't want to ruin his housewarming memory. I wanted him happy. I wanted him proud. But I also knew happiness built on a lie is not protection. It's just a prettier fall. So, I let go. The envelope disappeared into the house, and in that second, I felt something release in me. Not peace, not exactly, but inevitability. The truth was now inside his home, not as a shouted accusation, not as a father's bitterness, as paper, as evidence, as a warning. And once the truth enters a space, it doesn't always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it waits. It lets the music play. It lets the guests laugh. It lets the night finish looking normal until the door closes behind the last person and the silence makes room for the first real question.
I drove home then. The drive felt longer than usual, even though the roads were the same. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my thoughts weren't. I kept imagining Evan finding the envelope too soon, opening it in front of Gerald, and Gerald laughing it off while turning it into a joke about old men being jealous. That was my fear. Not that Evan would be angry, that Gerald would intercept the truth before it could reach his unguarded mind. But another part of me, the part that knows my son more deeply than his adult arrogance likes to admit, believed something else. Evan may be proud, but he's not stupid. He may be hungry, but he's still capable of seeing once he's given enough facts. He may be embarrassed of me sometimes, but he still has my stubbornness in him. If the evidence was solid enough, it would land eventually. That night, I barely slept. Not because I regretted the envelope, but because I knew what it would do. I knew it was a match in a room full of fumes, and I was terrified my son would choose the fumes anyway. Sometime after midnight, my phone buzzed. One message, from Evan. "Did you leave something here?" That was it. No, "Why did you leave?" No, "Are you okay?" Just that, like the envelope was an inconvenience he needed explained. I stared at the screen for a full minute before I answered. My first impulse was to tell him everything, to pour out the whole truth in one flood. But I didn't, because the truth doesn't land in someone's heart when their pride is still standing at the door with its arms crossed. So I replied with the simplest line I could manage. "Yes, it's for you. Please read it alone." He didn't answer for a while. Those minutes felt like hours. I kept picturing him opening it at the kitchen island while Gerald was still there. Gerald leaning in, guiding the narrative, directing the interpretation, turning evidence into disrespect, and protecting himself by controlling Evan's reaction. Then another message came. "What is this, Dad?" That question told me he had opened it. He had seen enough to be rattled, but not enough to understand yet. Not enough to be calm, not enough to be certain. Exactly the state Gerald would want him in. Confused and emotional, because confused and emotional people look for the nearest authority to tell them what it means. I typed and deleted and typed again. Finally, I wrote, "It's paperwork. Read all of it. Start with the page on top." I watched the typing bubbles appear and disappear, appear and disappear. That little modern detail, typing bubbles, felt absurdly intimate in a moment that could reshape our whole relationship. This was my son, alone in his new house, reading documents that might destroy his fantasy of the man he had just toasted. Then his next message came, shorter. "Is this real?" That question made my throat tighten, because it was no longer defensive, it was frightened. And underneath the fear, I heard something else. Doubt. Not doubt in me, doubt in Gerald. That was the escalation finally landing. I answered, "Yes." He didn't text back after that. For almost an hour, nothing. I sat on my couch in the dark with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen like I could force the next moment to arrive by willing it. That's when the full weight of what I'd done hit me. I had put my son in a position where he would have to choose between pride and truth, between the man who made him feel impressive and the father he had just publicly replaced, between a fantasy that flatters and evidence that hurts. At around 1:17 a.m., my phone rang. Not a text, a call. I answered. "Dad," my son said, and his voice sounded different, smaller, shaken, not drunk, not angry, just stripped. I didn't speak right away, because I knew if I filled the silence too quickly, I would rob him of the one thing he needed to do in that moment, sit inside the reality long enough to feel it. He swallowed and said, Gerald is still here." My stomach dropped, because now the moment I feared most was real. Gerald had not left. He was in the house, in Evan's space, close enough to shape the narrative, close enough to intercept. Evan whispered, "Gerald is saying you're trying to sabotage me. He says you're bitter. He says you don't understand." And there it was, the play. Predictable, smooth. Gerald trying to convert proof into emotion, emotion into dismissal, dismissal into obedience. I closed my eyes,
and felt something old rise in me. Not anger, determination. I said very calmly, "Put me on speaker." Evan hesitated. "Dad," I said, "put me on speaker." A few seconds, then I heard the tiny shift of the phone. A click. The room sound changed. And then I heard Gerald's voice, warm as honey. "Bill," he said, like we were old friends, like he hadn't just been toasted as the father my son needed while I sat there invisible. "This is really unnecessary." Unnecessary. That word made my hands tighten. But I kept my voice steady because the moment wasn't about my pride anymore. It was about controlling the terms of reality. I said, "Gerald, you can call it whatever you want, but those documents are real. Evan's name is on them, and if he stays in your deal, he's the one holding the liability." Gerald cluttered softly. "Liability," he repeated, amused. "You've been doing a lot of reading. I appreciate the concern, but you're scaring him for nothing." Then Evan spoke, voice trembling. "Gerald, why am I listed as managing member?" Silence. Just a second, but enough, because skilled liars don't go silent unless they are deciding which lie is safest. Gerald finally said, "It's just a formality. It doesn't mean what you think." And that was when I knew the envelope had done its job. Evan was asking the question, not defending Gerald, not dismissing me.
I said, "Evan, read the section highlighted, out loud." Evan breathed shakily and started reading. Legal language, responsibility, authority, financial exposure, personal risk in certain circumstances. Not poetic, not dramatic, just precise enough to scare the fantasy right out of the room. Gerald's tone changed, now sharper. "Okay, stop. This is ridiculous." I heard movement, like a chair scraping or a step forward. Evan's voice rose slightly, still shaky but firmer. "No, answer me." And in that moment, I felt the night truly escalate beyond the party, beyond the toast, beyond my humiliation. My son was finally confronting the man he had crowned. The father figure he always needed was being asked to prove his love with honesty. And men like Gerald, when pressed for honesty, usually reveal exactly what they are. Gerald exhaled, and his warmth disappeared from his voice. "You're overreacting," he said. "Your father is putting ideas in your head." That line landed differently now, because Evan didn't respond like a loyal son protecting his mentor. He responded like a man whose trust had just cracked. Evan said, "My father didn't put my name on that paperwork. You did." And the room went silent again. I could feel, even through the phone, the moment shifting. The fantasy was breaking. The power dynamic was changing. And once a young man sees the first crack in the hero he worshipped, everything he just said in a toast starts echoing back to him like a humiliation of his own making. Evan's voice lowered. "I need you to leave, Gerald." I heard Gerald laugh once, but it wasn't warm anymore. It was sharp, offended. "After everything I've done for you?" Evan didn't answer, not immediately. And that pause told me he was thinking, replaying, recalculating. That's what evidence does when it finally lands. It forces memory to reorganize. Then Evan said, "Leave, now." And I heard footsteps, a door, the faint sound of Gerald's voice fading with something like disgust in it. When the door closed, Evan spoke again, and this time his voice broke. "Dad, what did I do?" That was the moment the party finally ended for real. Not when I left, not when the toast happened, when my son was alone in his new house with the truth and realized his perfect night was built on the wrong man's hands. When Evan whispered, "Dad, what did I do?" I almost answered the way fathers like me always answer when their kids are breaking. I almost rushed to soften it, almost said, "It's okay, you didn't mean it, we'll talk tomorrow." But I didn't, because this wasn't the kind of moment that heals with comfort. This was the kind of moment that only heals if the truth is allowed to fully land, if the shame is allowed to be felt all the way through, instead of being padded with excuses. I said quietly, "Breathe, son." That's all, at first. Just breathe. Because I could hear how close he was to spiraling, and spiraling is exactly what men like Gerald count on. Confused people reach for the nearest confident voice. Gerald's voice had just been that for Evan for years. Now the voice was gone, and the absence of it was terrifying. Not because Gerald was good, because dependency feels like love until it's interrupted. Evan's breathing was rough through the phone. I could hear him pacing. Then he said, "I read it. I read the documents. I don't understand why he would—" He stopped, because he did understand. He just didn't want to say it out loud yet. Saying it out loud would make it real. Saying it out loud would mean admitting he had praised the wrong man in front of everyone, while the right man sat there swallowing it. Evan's voice got smaller. "Dad, why didn't you tell me sooner?" There it was, the question that sounds fair until you realize it's also a shield. Because if he could make this about my timing, he wouldn't have to sit as long with what he did at the toast. He could redirect the pain into logistics again. I said, "I tried, and I meant it. I didn't say it with drama. I said it like a fact. I tried to ask questions. You laughed. You told me I wouldn't understand. You didn't send me the paperwork. You weren't in a place where you could hear me, so I did the only thing I could do without making you dig in deeper." He went quiet, because he remembered. He remembered the phone calls, the defensiveness, the way he treated my concern like insecurity, the way he used Gerald's confidence as proof and my weakness as weakness. Silence is different when it's full of memory. Evan finally said, "He really was using me." It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. And when he said it, I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't expect. Not relief. Relief is too clean a word for what it feels like to watch your child's illusion break. It was more like grief with a purpose. Grief because he had been misled, and grief because I knew the breaking would hurt him in ways he hadn't prepared for. But purpose too, because now the truth was no longer my suspicion, it was his reality. I said, "Yes." Then I added, "And I'm sorry." Not sorry for the envelope, sorry that it had come to this. Sorry that my son had been so hungry for a father figure that a man like Gerald could walk into that hunger and feed it with poison. My own clumsy fatherhood had left gaps other men could exploit. I don't carry guilt for my imperfections the way I used to, but I do carry responsibility for what my son needed when he was young, and how I sometimes didn't know how to give it in the language he could receive. Evan's voice shook. I toasted him. I didn't respond right away. I let the sentence hang, because yes, he did, and he needed to hear himself say it without me rushing in to minimize it. People learn to respect pain only when they stop immediately trying to escape it. Then he said, "I said he was the father figure I always needed." His voice broke on the word father. Not mine, his. Because in that moment, he finally understood what he had done to himself too. He had handed a title to a man who didn't deserve it. He had made his own hunger public. He had declared loyalty to someone who was positioning him as liability. That kind of embarrassment is brutal. It makes you want to crawl out of your skin. I said, "I heard." Simple, not accusatory, not gentle either. Just truth. Evans whispered, "You were sitting there." It wasn't a question. It was him realizing the cruelty in its full shape, not abstract anymore, personal. His father, me, had been in the room while he crowned another man with the role that was mine, whether he honored it or not. And he had done it without looking at me once. That detail hit him now the way it hit me earlier. I said, "Yes." And then, because there was no point pretending anymore, I added, "That was hard." Evan's breathing turned uneven. I didn't mean it that way. There it was, the first instinct people have when they realize they've been cruel. Explain intent. And I believe him, in a way. I believe he didn't stand up that night thinking, "I'm going to humiliate my dad."
But intent doesn't erase impact, and becoming an adult means learning to hold both. I said, "You meant it enough to say it out loud." He made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. "Dad, I don't know what's wrong with me." That line almost undid me, because it sounded like the little boy he used to be when he'd wake up from nightmares after his mother left. It sounded like a child looking for ground. So I gave him ground, but not escape. I said, "Nothing is wrong with you. You were hungry, and the wrong man fed you." He was quiet. Then he said, "And you just stayed quiet. You didn't embarrass me." I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was such a son thing to finally notice. Yes, I stayed quiet, but not because I was noble, because I knew public confrontation would turn me into the jealous father and Gerald into the calm mentor. I stayed quiet because I was choosing the only approach that might actually reach him. I said, "I wasn't going to fight you in front of an audience. You've been living your whole adult life in rooms where you want to look impressive. If I forced you to choose your pride and my warning in front of people, you would have chosen pride. That's not an insult, that's human." So I left, and I let the paper speak when the room was quiet. Evan's voice dropped. "The letter." He said it like he'd been avoiding it, like he'd looked at it and then put it down because it was the part he feared most. Documents are one kind of truth, a father's words are another. "Did you read it?" He hesitated. "Not all of it." I said, "Read it now." He didn't respond. I said his name, Evan, "Read it now." And then I heard him sit, the faint rustle of paper, the quiet of him unfolding something he wasn't ready to hold. I stayed silent, listening to the sounds of my own handwriting being touched by the son who had just publicly replaced me. After a moment, he started reading out loud, voice unsteady, like he didn't trust his own eyes. "I'm not writing this to punish you. I'm writing it because I love you more than I love being right." He stopped, his breath hitched. I didn't speak. I let him keep going. "You can call Gerald whatever you want in public, but I need you to know the difference between a man who wants your praise and a man who would bleed quietly to protect you." He broke there, fully. I could hear it in his voice, the crack that happens when pride finally stops holding the body upright. He whispered, "Dad." I said, "Keep reading." He did, slower now. "I wasn't perfect. I worked too much. I didn't know how to say the warm words. I thought paying the bills was a love language, and I didn't realize you needed love spoken too." He stopped again, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like someone realizing a whole childhood with new eyes. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" he asked, almost like he was angry at the past itself. I said, "Because I didn't know how, and because I thought you already knew." He whispered, "I didn't." That sentence was the turning point. Not the documents, not Gerald leaving. That, "I didn't." The moment my son admitted out loud that my love had not been received the way I thought it was, that he had been hungry in ways I didn't fully understand, and that his hunger had made him vulnerable to the wrong man. He kept reading, and the letter moved into the part that mattered most. "If you're angry at me, be angry later, but don't sign anything else until you understand what it makes you responsible for, and don't confuse a man's confidence with his care." He read that line twice. I could hear it. The second time he read it more softly, like it finally belonged to him. Then he said, almost inaudible, I signed what he asked me to sign." My stomach turned. "How much?" Evan swallowed. Not everything, but enough." Then, in a voice full of shame, he added, "He said it was normal. He said this is how you learn. He said it was family." Family. The same word, different man, same mechanism. People love to use that word when they want your loyalty without your protection. I closed my eyes and felt the whole story connect itself cleanly. The toast wasn't just praise, it was allegiance.
Evan had been giving Gerald father-level trust, father-level obedience, father-level access, and now that father-level trust had been leveraged into legal exposure. I said, "Okay, listen to me. Tonight, you do not sign anything else. You don't send any more emails. You don't manage meetings alone. You screenshot everything. You forward every email to yourself and to someone you trust. And tomorrow, you get a lawyer who works for you, not his." Evan nodded, even though I couldn't see him. "Okay," he whispered. Then he said, "Dad, I'm sorry." Those two words should have made me feel victorious. They didn't. They made me tired, sad, soft in a way.
Soft in a way that I hadn't allowed myself all night. Because the apology was real now. Not a performance, not a defense, not an excuse. It sounded like a man who finally understood he had hurt the one person who never meant him harm. I said, "I know." He cried then, quietly, not dramatically, the kind of crying men do when they're trying to stay composed but the body refuses. And as he cried, I understood the truth of the turning point. The party hadn't broken our relationship, it had exposed it. Gerald hadn't become the father Evan needed because I failed completely. Gerald became possible because Evan carried a wound, and I carried my love too quietly to heal it properly. And now, for the first time in years, we were both looking at the wound honestly. No audience, no toast, no polished man in the room. Just a son in a new house with an envelope in his hands, and a father on the other end of the line finally being heard. Not as jealous, not bitter, but as what he had always been. His father. The one who stayed, the one who protected, even when the only thanks he got for it was silence. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm, like my body had been on watch all night. I didn't feel rested. I felt alert, the way you feel after a near accident, alive but not calm. My phone was already in my hand before I was fully sitting up because a part of me kept thinking, what if Gerald goes to him first? What if he gets to him before the truth settles? What if he turns that crack back into obedience? And right on time, Evan called. "Dad," he said, and his voice sounded hoarse, like he'd barely slept either. "Gerald is calling nonstop. He wants to meet today. He says we need to clear this up." That sentence made my stomach tighten because I've heard that language before, in different forms. Clear this up. It's what people say when they want to re-establish control after being exposed. It sounds reasonable, but it's a leash. It's an invitation back into the fog. It's a way to make you think the problem is misunderstanding instead of structure. I said, "You're not meeting him alone." Evan hesitated, and I could hear the panic under the sigh. "Dad, he knows people. He's saying if I back out now, I'll ruin everything. He's saying I'm ungrateful. He's saying I owe him." There it was again. Owe, the language of emotional debt. Gerald couldn't argue the paperwork anymore, so he was shifting to obligation. That's what manipulators do when facts stop obeying. They become moral accountants. I said, "Listen to me. Today, you get your own lawyer. Not his, not the company's, yours." Evan hesitated, and I could hear he didn't know where to start. And that right there was the moment that broke my heart in a way the toast never did. Not because he was weak, because he sounded like a kid again, scared and searching for direction after years spent trying to prove he didn't need me. I wanted to tell him I'd handle it for him like I used to when he was little, but he wasn't little anymore, and this wasn't a scraped knee. This was a man in a suit trying to attach my son's future to a contract like a hook. I said, "Start by not signing anything else. Then text me your email. I'm sending you a contact."
Because the truth is, I had already done some of that work too, quietly, before the party. I had asked around after Cliff's warning. I had found a business attorney through a guy in the union who owed me a favor from years ago. Not because I wanted to interfere in Evan's life, but because I could feel the danger getting closer, and I didn't know how else to protect him without being dismissed as jealous. I sent Evan the attorney's number and told him to call immediately. Evan did, and within 2 hours the temperature of everything changed again, because legal clarity has a way of stripping charm right off a situation. Evan called me back from his car, voice lower. "Dad, my lawyer says I'm on the hook for things I didn't understand." His voice cracked slightly on understand. "There's a personal guarantee. There's stuff that makes me responsible if the project goes sideways. Gerald told me it was just a formality." Formality. That was Gerald's favorite kind of lie. The kind that sounds like professionalism but means don't ask questions, don't slow down, don't protect yourself. Trust me. Let me keep driving while you sit in the passenger seat holding the risk. I said, "How much?" Evan exhaled like the number tasted bitter. $280,000. I went cold, not because I'd never heard numbers like that, but because I knew what they would do to a man like Evan. Not just financially, psychologically. That kind of debt doesn't just empty an account, it empties a future. It chains you to fear. It turns every decision into survival. And Gerald knew that, which meant Gerald's plan was never mentorship, it was control. Control through exposure. Evan whispered, "Dad, I think he set me up to be the fall guy." Fall guy. The words sounded grown, but the fear behind them sounded like a boy realizing the adult world can hurt him in ways he can't fight with pride. I didn't let my voice rise. I didn't let my anger give Evan anything else to manage. I said, "Okay, good. Now we know what we're dealing with." He said, "My lawyer wants me to come in and sign a letter saying I'm revoking authority and I'm not consenting to any more moves." I said, "Do it." Then Evan said the sentence that turned my blood to ice. "Gerald is coming over. He says he wants to talk face to face." My mind flashed to the night before. Gerald still in the house. Gerald laughing. Gerald calling me unnecessary. Gerald trying to keep Evan emotional and confused, because emotional and confused people can be guided. This wasn't a conversation. This was pressure arriving at Evan's door. I said, "Don't let him in." Evan breathed fast. "Dad, he's already outside." And just like that, the clock started running the way it always does when a manipulator realizes his victim is slipping. Gerald wasn't going to send warm texts anymore. He was going to show up with his presence, his authority, his calm voice, his implied threats. He was going to push for one more signature, one more verbal agreement, one more moment of weakness he could later describe as consent. And Evan, still new to resisting him, was going to have to hold a boundary with his whole body, not just his mind. I said, "Stay on the phone with me. Put him on speaker if you can." Evan did. I heard the door open, the faint echo of Gerald's shoes on the entryway floor, and then Gerald's voice smooth again, as if nothing had happened the night before. "Evan," he said warmly, "I've been worried about you. You look exhausted. These things can get overwhelming when you don't have experience." Experience. That word was another leash. It was meant to make Evan feel small enough to accept guidance again. Evan's voice was tight. "Why didn't you tell me about the guarantee?" There was a pause, Gerald's breath through the phone. Then he gave the most dangerous kind of answer, the answer that blames you for not trusting him. "Because I didn't think you'd panic. I thought you trusted me." I felt my hands clench. Of course, he made the omission sound like protection, and Evan's desire for transparency sound like insecurity. That's how men like Gerald keep control while looking caring. Evan swallowed. "Do I owe $280,000 if this goes wrong?" Gerald's voice hardened by a fraction. "That's not how it works." Evan's voice rose slightly, not loud, but sharper. "That's not an answer." That moment right there, that insistence, that refusal to accept warm fog as response, was the first time I heard my son sound like my son in the best way. Not polished, not trying to impress, just stubborn and clear. That same stubbornness that used to show up when he was 8 and insisted he could ride his bike without training wheels. That stubbornness had once terrified me because I knew the world can punish it. Now it saved him. Gerald exhaled. I could hear irritation creeping in. Evan, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. Bigger than it needs to be. That was the same sentence my son had once used on me. That's how you know the influence wasn't just professional. Gerald had been shaping Evan's emotional language too, teaching him how to dismiss discomfort, teaching him how to keep inconvenient truth small, teaching him how to call urgency drama. That realization made me feel sick, because Gerald hadn't just used Evan's ambition, he'd colonized his perception. And then Evan said something I didn't expect, something that made my chest ache with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He said, "You need to leave my house." Gerald laughed once, sharp. "Excuse me?" Evan repeated it, stronger. "Leave." Gerald's tone turned cold. "After everything I've done for you?" Evan didn't answer immediately, and in that pause, I could feel him doing the hardest thing young men ever have to do, reevaluating the story they used to make them powerful. Because Gerald's everything wasn't nothing. Gerald had opened doors. He had introduced Evan to people. He had praised him. He had made him feel chosen. Those are real emotional services, and predators know that. They make you feel lifted, so you don't notice where they're actually positioning your feet. Evan was standing in the wreckage of that realization now, and still he held the boundary. Evan said, "Leave," and then he added, voice breaking, "Right now." I heard movement, footsteps, Gerald muttering something under his breath that sounded like disgust. Then the door shut. The sound was ordinary, but it landed like a verdict, because in that sound was the collapse of a whole fantasy. Gerald had been expelled from the house he had just been toasted in. The father figure had been told to leave. The man Evan had publicly owed everything to was reduced to a problem standing outside with his keys and his rage. I waited for Evan to speak, and when he did, his voice sounded like someone's whose body was still catching up to what his mouth had just done. "Dad," he whispered, "I kicked him out." I didn't say good job like he was a child. I didn't praise him, not because he didn't deserve it, but because I could hear the shock in him, the grief, the disorientation. That's the price of waking up. It's not just relief, it's mourning the version of reality you just lost. I said, "I know." Then I said, "Now we move fast." Because the truth is, removing Gerald from the house didn't remove Gerald from the paperwork, and paperwork is where Gerald planted his real leverage. Evan still had liability attached to his name. Deals were likely still in motion. People in Gerald's network might still be expecting Evan's signature or compliance. Gerald might try to retaliate, threaten Evan professionally, smear him, pressure him through colleagues. Men like Gerald don't let go cleanly when their advantage is threatened. They tighten and lash before they retreat. So yes, the emotional climax happened in that house, Evan choosing
truth over fantasy. But the practical climax was still coming. The part where Evan's name, his new home, his career, his credit, his future would either be freed or dragged into Gerald's fall. Evan met his lawyer that afternoon. He sent me screenshots from the attorney's office, forms he was signing to revoke authority, notices to counterparties, emails drafted in careful language to create a record that he was not consenting to further transactions. The lawyer told him not to speak to Gerald directly anymore. Let counsel handle it. Let paper counter paper. That advice wasn't just legal. It was psychological. It was a way to keep Evan from being manipulated back into the fog through shame, fear, or pride. Evan called me after the meeting, voice steadier but still raw. He said, "Dad, I feel sick." Then he said, "I did that toast." Again, the toast kept returning because that was his public mistake. That was the part that felt irreversible. You can revoke a signature, you can restructure a deal, but you can't unsay a public sentence about who you believe your father is.
He was living inside that shame now, and I could hear him wanting me to absolve him so he could escape it. I didn't absolve him, not because I wanted him to suffer, because if I erased it too quickly, the lesson would evaporate. And Evan needed the lesson, not as punishment, but as protection. If he learned that he could humiliate his father publicly and fix it later with a private apology, he might never fully respect the weight of his own words. Words are not harmless just because they're said with a smile. Words are how we build altars. Evan had built one for Gerald, and now he had to sit with what that meant. I said, "We'll talk about the toast later." Then I added, "Right now, you focus on getting free." Evan whispered, "Okay." And then, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deeper than his pride, he said, "I need to see you." That sentence landed like a second turning point, not because it was dramatic, because it was new. Evan never asked to see me like that anymore. He invited me to things, he included me in polite ways, but he didn't need me. Not out loud, not like that. This need wasn't about money or fixing a shelf. It was emotional. It was a son reaching for a father after realizing he had been starving himself of something real while chasing something impressive. I said, "Where?" He said, "Your place, if that's okay." If that's okay. The way he said it, careful, almost afraid, told me he wasn't only asking to come over. He was asking if he still had a father to return to after what he had done. I said, "Yes." My voice was steady, but my hands were shaking when I hung up, not from anger, but from the weight of it. Because the climax of a father's life is not winning a fight. It's watching your child come back from the edge of a lie and realizing the return will require you to be both honest and merciful in the same breath. And that's hard. Harder than overtime. Harder than doing everything alone. Harder than swallowing humiliation at a party. Because mercy without truth enables, and truth without mercy destroys. A real father has to hold both. When Evan arrived that evening, he looked different. Not physically, emotionally. His shoulders were tight like he'd been carrying something heavy. His eyes were red. His confidence, the polished housewarming confidence, was gone. In its place was something raw, more human. He stood on my porch for a second, like he didn't know whether to step fully into the space he had spent years treating as a place he had outgrown. I opened the door and didn't move out of the way immediately, not to block him, to make the moment real, to make him choose it. Evan stepped inside. He looked around my small living room like he was seeing it for the first time in years. The worn couch, the old photos, the quiet, the lack of shine. And something in his face changed. Grief, maybe. Recognition, or the beginning of it. He said, "Dad?" And then he stopped, like the word itself was too heavy. And right there, standing in the doorway of my small home, my grown son started crying. Not loud, not performative. The kind of crying that looks like a man losing the last piece of a story he used to survive himself on. He put his head down and whispered, "I'm sorry." Again, but this time not as a sentence he wanted me to accept quickly, as a truth he couldn't carry alone anymore. I didn't hug him immediately. I know how that sounds, but I needed him to stand in it. I needed him to feel that apologies aren't magic spells, they're openings, and openings require work to become something new. Evan looked up at me, face wet, and said, I thought he was what I needed." Then he said, "And I said it out loud in front of you." I nodded once. "You did." He flinched like the confirmation hurt more than any insult. And maybe it did, because now he couldn't hide behind the fantasy that I hadn't noticed, that it wasn't that bad, that he could pretend it was a compliment to Gerald and not a wound to me. The truth was finally being spoken plainly in a room with no audience to clap over it. And that's when he said the sentence that shook me more than anything else. He said, "I don't know how to be your son without feeling embarrassed." Embarrassed. There it was. The thing that I had sensed for years but never heard him confess. Not hatred, not contempt. Embarrassment. the shame of being from something ordinary, the uncomfort of having a father who didn't look like the men he admired. That confession cut deep, because it wasn't cruel, it was honest. And honesty, even painful honesty, is the only doorway to real repair. I finally stepped forward then and put a hand on his shoulder. Not a full hug, just contact, ground. I said, "You don't have to be proud of me in the way you're proud of Gerald." But I added, "You have to be fair." I paused. "And you have to be careful, because men like Gerald don't choose boys like you because you're weak. They choose you because you're hungry and capable. They want your shine, they want your name, they want your work, and they will call it love as long as you keep calling it fatherhood." Evan nodded, crying harder now, not because I was attacking him, but because the truth had finally found the right place to land. He whispered, "He was going to destroy me." I said, "Yes." Then I added the part Evan wasn't ready for, but needed anyway. "And you almost helped him do it, because you wanted to believe he was the father you always needed." That was the climax in its fullest form. Not the toast, not the party, not Gerald being kicked out. This moment, my son standing in my living room admitting his hunger, his shame, his vulnerability, and the danger he almost walked into while I stood outside his celebration holding an envelope like a last line of defense. Evan's perfect life shook, yes, but the real shaking wasn't the deal. It was his identity. The story he had built about who made him and who saved him. And once that story breaks, everything has to be rebuilt on truth instead of performance. That's when I realized the hardest part was still ahead. Not escaping Gerald, not repairing the paperwork. The hardest part would be rebuilding something between me and Evan that had been slowly starving for years. Father and son, not as roles, not as obligations, but two human beings finally telling the truth in the quiet after the applause died.
The next few weeks moved in two directions at the same time. On the outside, everything became paperwork and strategy. On the inside, everything became silence and repair. That's how it often is when a family crisis is also a relationship reckoning. One part of you is sending emails, signing affidavits, sitting across from attorneys. The other part of you is sitting at your kitchen table, staring at your own hands, trying to understand how you raised a son who could call another man his father in public and still cry in your doorway like a child when the truth finally caught him. Evan's lawyer moved fast, faster than I expected, honestly, and that speed was its own kind of relief. She sent notices revoking authority, clarifying that Evan would not be signing any further documents, and demanding copies of communications, drafts, meeting notes, anything that showed pressure or misrepresentation. Evan forwarded everything he had, emails, texts, calendar invites, the glossy opportunity deck Gerald had presented. And as the documents lined up in legal language, the story became clearer and uglier. Gerald hadn't just encouraged ambition, he had structured Evan's ambition as a shield. Evan was positioned as the responsible name, while Gerald kept himself insulated behind layers of entities, advisors, and plausible deniability. Gerald wanted Evan's hunger, Evan's credibility, Evan's youth, Evan's clean image. If the deal succeeded, Gerald would call it mentorship. If it failed, Evan would be the one holding the bag. That was the pattern. And the more Evan saw it in black and white, the more his voice changed. The panic became disgust. The confusion became anger, not at me anymore, at Gerald, at himself, at the version of masculinity that taught him to worship polish more than presence.
Gerald tried to retaliate the way men like him always do when charm stops working. First, he tried softness. "Let's talk. We're family. Your dad is misunderstanding." Then he tried threat, disguised as professional consequence. "This industry is smaller than you think. People won't want to work with you if you're unstable. You're burning bridges." Evan didn't respond. His lawyer did. And there is nothing more humiliating to a manipulator than having their private pressure translated into official correspondence. Threats lose power when they become evidence. Gerald's language got sharper, then quieter, then he stopped calling. That's another truth I learned. Some predators are not stopped by conscience, they're stopped by process. They back away when they realize the victim is no longer alone and the paper trail is being preserved. By the end of the third week, the biggest pieces were contained. Not everything was perfectly clean, legal matters are rarely clean, but the immediate catastrophic risk was reduced. Evan wasn't fully free, but he wasn't standing alone in it anymore, and Gerald had lost direct access to him. There would likely be further negotiations, possibly litigation, and consequences for Gerald depending on how far the evidence went. But the trap had been interrupted before it could close fully. That mattered. It mattered in the way a father feels relief in his bones when he realizes the worst version of the story has been prevented. And then there was the other direction, the part between Evan and me. Evan started coming by on Sundays, not every Sunday at first. He came awkwardly, like he didn't know the new version of our relationship was supposed to look like. He'd bring groceries I didn't ask for. He'd fix small things around the house that didn't really need fixing. He'd offer to mow the lawn like he was trying to prove usefulness, because usefulness is what men sometimes reach for when feelings are too exposed. The first time he did it, I almost snapped, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I could feel him trying to buy his way out of shame with tasks. But then I remembered he was my son, and he was learning. He had spent years thinking love was admiration. Now he was learning love is accountability, and accountability doesn't feel polished. It feels clumsy. So I let him mow the lawn. I let him fix a loose hinge. I let him bring groceries. And then, slowly, we started talking. Not big talks at first, small ones, work updates, his house, the weather, normal father-son conversation, the kind people think is meaningless until you realize it's the first step back to humanity after a rupture. Then, one Sunday, he sat at my kitchen table and asked me a question so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "Dad, when Mum left, did you ever feel like it was your fault?" That question stopped me cold because it told me something I hadn't fully understood. Evan hadn't only been hungry for a father figure, he had been carrying a wound from childhood that he had never brought to me. He had been living with a silent question about why his mother left and what that meant about him and about me. And because I wasn't good at feelings back then, because I believed the best way to protect him was to keep moving, I think I had left him alone with parts of that wound without realizing it. I told him the truth. "Yes," I said, "I did." I told him there were nights after she left where I sat in the living room after he was asleep and wondered what I did wrong. I told him I was angry, scared, ashamed, and determined all at once. I told him I worked so much because I was terrified of failing him. I told him I didn't know how to talk about pain without feeling like it would swallow me. So I tried to build safety out of routine and bills and showing up. I watched Evan's face as I spoke, and I realized something I wish I had realized 20 years earlier. Sons don't only want fathers who provide, they want fathers who speak, not speeches, just truth. Evan cried that day, and so did I, quietly. Two men at a kitchen table finally letting the abandoned part of the story have language. That conversation didn't fix everything. Nothing fixes decades in one afternoon, but it changed the tone of our rebuilding. After that, Evan stopped trying to be impressive around me. He stopped posturing. He started asking questions, real questions, about my life, about what it was like raising him alone, about the jobs I did, the choices I made, the mistakes I regret. And I started answering, not perfectly, not with a therapist's vocabulary, but honestly. I started telling him things I had never said because I believed fatherhood meant being a wall, not a person. I loved him, out loud, more than once. The first time felt unnatural in my mouth, like a phrase meant for other men, but I said it anyway. Evan didn't respond with a big emotional scene. He just nodded, like he was trying to store the words somewhere deep. I think he needed to hear them from me more than he needed a dramatic apology from himself. We did talk about the toast eventually. We had to. You can't rebuild on a wound you refuse to touch. It was on a Wednesday evening, about a month after the party. Evan sat on my porch, staring at nothing, and said, "I hate myself for saying it." I didn't let him drown in self-hatred. Self-hatred is another escape route. It sounds like accountability, but it can become a way to make the injured person comfort you. I wouldn't do that. I said, "Don't hate yourself, learn." Then I told him what the toast did to me. Not in a dramatic way, in the plain way old men speak when they're done pretending. I told him it felt like being erased while still alive, like my whole fatherhood had been reduced to the parts he didn't like. I told him it felt like all my sacrifices were being handed to another man as a trophy. Evan listened without interrupting. That was important. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain intent. He just listened. When he finished, he said, "I'm sorry," again. But this time it didn't sound like a plea for forgiveness. It sounded like a recognition of harm, and that made it different. I didn't tell him everything was fine. It wasn't. Wounds like that don't vanish. But I told him something else, something I think mattered more. I told him, "You don't owe me worship. You owe me respect." Then I added, "And you owe yourself the truth about why you needed Gerald so badly." That became part of Evan's work, not with me, but with himself. He started therapy. He didn't announce it publicly. He just told me one day, almost embarrassed, "I'm talking to someone." I nodded and said, "Good," because therapy isn't weakness. It's what you do when you're tired of repeating the same hunger in different forms. Evan had been looking for fatherhood in the wrong place. Now he was finally asking why. Gerald's reputation, meanwhile, began to crack in Evan's professional circle, not because we went on a smear campaign, because truth tends to travel when enough paper exists and enough people quietly realize they're not the only ones who felt uneasy. Evan's lawyer wasn't subtle, and rightly so. Once Gerald saw that Evan wasn't going to quietly absorb liability, he stopped treating Evan like family and started treating him like a threat. That shift revealed Gerald to other people too. It's hard to maintain the image of a generous mentor when you're suddenly angry that your mentee wants legal clarity. The mask doesn't fit as well in bright light. Evan lost opportunities tied to Gerald's circle, but he also gained something more valuable, a life that didn't depend on one powerful man's approval. The strangest part of the resolution is that I didn't feel like I won. There was no victory in watching my son be fooled, humiliate me, and then wake up in pain. There was only relief that he woke up before the damage became irreversible, and a quiet gratitude that he came back to my porch instead of sinking deeper into pride. And I also didn't feel like Gerald was the main villain anymore. He was a predator, yes, but predators don't succeed unless the environment is ready.
Evan's hunger was real. My emotional stiffness was real. The mother leaving was real. The culture that taught Evan to admire polish more than presence was real. Gerald just exploited what was already there. So the resolution for me was not just saving Evan from Gerald, it was finally letting Evan see me as human, not as a fixed symbol of what he lacked. It was letting him see that I wasn't absent, I was exhausted. I wasn't uncaring, I was untrained in softness. I wasn't worthless, I was flawed and present, and still somehow the man who protected him when the polished mentor tried to turn him into a liability. And yes, Evan eventually apologized publicly too. Not at the next party, not with a big speech, but in smaller ways that mattered more. He introduced me differently to people, not as a label, as a story. This is my dad. He raised me. He invited me to his home for dinner when no one else was there, and sat across from me like he actually wanted to know me, not just tolerate me. And one day, months later, he said something quietly while we were washing dishes, like he didn't want it to become another performance. He said, "I used to think fatherhood was a vibe. I didn't realize it was a decision you make every day, even when you're tired." I didn't answer with a big emotional reaction. I just nodded, because sometimes that kind of recognition is the closest thing to a father's trophy that actually matters. We are not a perfect father and son now. We never will be. Some damage leaves its mark, but we are real. We speak more. We ask more. We don't let silence do the thinking for us anymore. And if I had to name the real resolution of the story, it would be this. My son finally learned the difference between the man who makes you feel chosen and the man who chooses you even when you don't clap for it. Gerald wanted applause. I wanted my son safe. Evan finally saw which of those is love.
If I could put one lesson from this story into the simplest words possible, it would be this. Children don't always reject their parents because the parents didn't love them. Sometimes they reject them because the parents loved them in a language the child didn't know how to hear. And when that happens, the child goes looking for the missing language somewhere else, often in the arms, advice, approval, or mentorship of someone who is skilled at sounding like what the child wanted all along. That's what happened to Evan. He didn't wake up one day and decide, "I'm going to hurt my father." He woke up carrying an old hunger that never got named properly, and Gerald walked into that hunger like a man walking into a room he knew was already unlocked. There are two kinds of men in the world who love being called father by someone else's son. The first kind is rare and good, the kind who wants to guide without owning, who gives without extracting, who protects the younger man's dignity by making him stronger, not more dependent. The second kind is much more common than people want to admit, the kind who uses fatherhood as a title, a shortcut to loyalty, a way to get access without earning trust the hard way. Those men don't want sons, they want devotion. They want someone hungry enough to obey. They want the shine of being admired without the grind of raising someone when it's messy and unglamorous. They want the applause, not the responsibility. Gerald was that second kind. He didn't want to be a father figure to Evan because he loved him. He wanted to be a father figure because it gave him control. And here's the part that still makes me swallow hard. My son's hunger for a father figure didn't make him weak. It made him human. It made him vulnerable. Vulnerability isn't shameful, it's just dangerous when it's hidden, because hidden vulnerability gets exploited. That's one of the biggest takeaways I carry now as an older man. The vulnerabilities you don't name are the ones that get recruited into someone else's agenda.
Evan never sat down and told me, "Dad, I feel you were never truly there emotionally." He didn't say, "Dad, I'm still angry Mom left." He didn't say, "Dad, I'm embarrassed of where we came from." He carried those things silently and tried to outgrow them through achievement. And when Gerald praised him in the exact tone he wanted, Evan mistook that praise for fatherhood. That is not stupidity. That is psychology. That is pain looking for a home. I also learned something about fathers, about men like me. We often believe that love is a thing we do, not a thing we say. We believe showing up is enough, that bills and consistency and sacrifice communicate everything that needs to be communicated. We believe that if we keep the roof over their head, they will naturally understand our heart. But children don't always interpret silence the way we intend it. Sometimes they interpret it as distance. Sometimes they interpret it as emotional absence. And that's the part I had to own without self-hatred. I did love Evan, but there were moments when my love was too quiet to heal the exact places he was hurting. That doesn't make me a bad father. It makes me a human father who raised a child through abandonment while trying not to drown in his own fear. If there is a message here for fathers, it's not be perfect. It's be present in more than one way. Don't let your child grow up thinking the only love that counts is the love that speaks well. The world is full of men who speak well. The world is full of men who can say the warm sentences. Some of them mean it. Some of them use it. If you don't teach your child the difference, they may learn it the hard way. And if there is a message here for sons and daughters, it's this: be careful who you crown while your real parent is still living. Gratitude is good. Mentors can be life-saving. Chosen family can be real. But when you use your public voice to erase the person who stayed, you don't just hurt them, you rewrite yourself into someone else's story. You make yourself easier to manipulate, because the people who want control love it when you've already separated yourself from the one person most likely to warn you. The first thing predators do is isolate. Sometimes they isolate you physically, sometimes they isolate you emotionally, by turning you against the people who know you best. Gerald didn't have to say, "Cut your father off." Evan did some of that work himself by pushing me into the background. That made Gerald's access cleaner. That's why I don't see the toast as only disrespect. I see it as a signal, a vulnerability declared out loud. This is the father I always needed. When Evan said that, he wasn't just praising Gerald, he was announcing a wound. He was announcing an opening, and the wrong man heard it as opportunity. I also want to say something about humility, because it's easy to confuse humility with silence. Humility is not letting people erase you. Humility is not swallowing humiliation so everyone else can call you mature. Real humility has backbone. It is quiet strength, not quiet surrender. The night of the housewarming, I left without a scene, yes, but I did not leave without truth. I placed truth into my son's hands in the only way he could receive it without his pride immediately rejecting it. That was not weakness, that was strategy. That was fatherhood evolving into a different form when the old form was no longer being accepted. And here's the hardest truth. Sometimes the people we love most don't understand our value until someone else tries to use them. Sometimes a child doesn't recognize the steady love of a parent until they taste the counterfeit version and feel what it costs. I wish Evan hadn't had to learn that way. I wish I had found a way to speak his language earlier. I wish his mother leaving hadn't carved a hunger in him that made him so vulnerable to polished men. But wishing doesn't change the past. What changes the future is what you do once the truth is finally on the table. For Evan, the turning point was not just learning Gerald's paperwork was dangerous. It was learning that real fatherhood doesn't always look impressive. Sometimes it looks tired. Sometimes it looks imperfect. Sometimes it looks like a man sitting alone at a party, swallowing humiliation to avoid becoming the villain, then going home and still protecting his son anyway. That's what I want people to understand about the quiet parents, the ones who aren't good with speeches, the ones who don't know how to package love attractively. They may not win in rooms full of applause, but they often win in the places that matter, in loyalty, in endurance, in protection, in the unglamorous daily decision to stay. And for me, the takeaway is bittersweet but clear. You can be replaced in your child's pride and still remain irreplaceable in their safety. That is not the kind of fatherhood I dreamed of when Evan was small. I wanted him to be my hero. I wanted him to look at me with admiration. But what I ended up being was something quieter and maybe more real. The man who stayed when his mother left, the man who kept the lights on, the man who swallowed his own loneliness so Evan didn't have to carry it. The man who couldn't speak love perfectly, but still recognized a predator in a suit and acted before the damage became permanent. If you take anything from this story, take this. Don't confuse polish with love. Don't confuse praise with protection. Don't confuse a man's confidence with his care. And if you are hungry for a father figure, name that hunger honestly before someone else feeds it for their own benefit. Because sometimes the father you always needed isn't the one who makes you feel powerful in public. Sometimes it's the one who protects you in private, even when you've already lifted your glass for someone else.
The strangest thing after everything settled was how quiet the world looked from the outside. Evan still had his new house. The pictures from the housewarming were still online for a while. People still commented things like, "So proud of you," and "What a beautiful home," and "You deserve it," like nothing in that night had cracked. Like a toast was just a toast, and not a hinge that can swing a whole life into a different direction. That's what aftermath often is. The public story keeps smiling, while the private story is still bleeding in the dark. Evan didn't sleep well for weeks. He told me later that he'd wake up in the middle of the night and replay the moment he raised his glass. He'd hear his own voice say, "Gerald is the father figure I always needed," and then he'd see my face in his memory, still, quiet, not making a scene, and the shame would hit him all over again like a wave he couldn't outswim. Shame does that when it's earned. It doesn't come once and leave. It returns until you've done enough real work to deserve peace. That's why I didn't rush to rescue him from it. I wanted him to change, not just feel bad. Evan's lawyer kept moving, and Gerald kept trying to apply pressure from a distance. He stopped showing up at Evan's door, but he started showing up in other ways. A message through a colleague, an advice disguised as a warning, an invitation to get back on track that sounded friendly but carried teeth underneath. Evan's lawyer documented every contact, every implied threat, every attempt to coerce, and that documentation became its own kind of power, because it meant Gerald couldn't just be a shadow anymore. He was being recorded, measured, preserved. Men like him hate that. They survive in ambiguity. They thrive in private conversations. They rely on people being too embarrassed to repeat what was said. Once a paper trail exists, their charm becomes liability. One afternoon, about a month after the party, Evan called me and said, "Dad, I think Gerald is trying to set me up again." My stomach dropped, not because I was surprised, but because I knew that's what predators do when they feel control slipping. They don't release, they reposition.
Evan said Gerald's assistant had sent a corrected document that supposedly needed Evan's signature to formally close the loop on his exit. Close the loop. That phrase sounded harmless, even responsible. But Evan's lawyer reviewed it and found clauses that would have reattached certain responsibilities to Evan under different language. Same hook, new bait. Evan said, "I almost signed it. I almost did." His voice sounded embarrassed, like he wanted me to scold him. I didn't. I said, "That's why you have a lawyer, and that's why you don't do this alone." Then I added something I didn't realize I needed to hear too. "You're not stupid, Evan. You're recovering from being manipulated." That was true. Manipulation doesn't end when the person leaves the room. It leaves an echo. It leaves self-doubt. It leaves that impulse to please, to smooth, to finish what the powerful person says needs finishing, just to stop feeling like you're in trouble. Evan was learning to interrupt that impulse. That takes time. Gerald's influence started dissolving in Evan's circle too, and not in some dramatic public takedown way, more like a slow change in temperature. People stopped mentioning Gerald as much. Meetings got rescheduled with vague explanations. Invitations stopped coming. Evan got quieter about work for a while, because losing a powerful man's favor feels at first like losing oxygen when you've built your confidence around that favor. Then, little by little, something else happened. New people reached out, not as flashy, not as smooth, but sincere. A colleague pulled Evan aside and said, "I've been wanting to warn you about Gerald for years, but I didn't think you'd hear me." Another said, "You did the right thing getting out." Evan told me these things like he couldn't believe them, like he couldn't believe there were adults in that world who had seen the pattern and simply stayed quiet because they assumed the young man wanted the fantasy more than the truth. That realization shook him, because it meant he wasn't the first one Gerald had fed on. He was just the one who finally stopped eating it. And then there was me. My own aftermath wasn't as visible as Evan's, but it was real. For a long time after the party, I would have these moments where I'd be doing something ordinary, like washing dishes, folding laundry, watching the news, and suddenly I'd remember his toast and feel the same quiet humiliation pulse through me. Not because Evan was still doing it, because I had never fully allowed myself to feel what it meant the first time. I had swallowed it so I could protect him, but swallowed pain doesn't disappear. It just waits for a safer hour to surface. I also had to reckon with something else. Relief can feel like grief's cousin. I was relieved Evan saw Gerald for what he was, but I also mourned the fact that it took a predator's paperwork for my son to finally look at me with anything close to honest eyes. That's a hard thing to admit as a father. It makes you feel petty even thinking it, but it's true. Part of me wanted Evan to come back because he missed me, not because he was scared. Part of me wanted to be chosen, not just needed. Fathers don't say that out loud much. We're taught to want less, to be satisfied with being useful. But usefulness without warmth is a lonely kind of love. Evan did start choosing me again in small ways, and those small ways were what actually healed me over time. He'd call to ask my opinion about something and actually wait for the answer. He'd come over and sit without checking his phone every 2 minutes. He'd tell a story about his day and then ask about mine and listen like it mattered. He started remembering to say thank you for things that had once been invisible to him. Not as a performance, as a recognition. One day he said quietly, "I never realized how much you did alone." That sentence landed in me like water hitting dry ground, because it wasn't dramatic, but it was true, and it came without excuses attached. We also had harder aftermath conversations, the ones that feel like walking through broken glass carefully. Evan told me he had always felt like he didn't know what kind of man he was supposed to become after his mother left. He said he watched other kids with dads who were loud, confident, affectionate in public, and he felt like something was missing at home, even though I was there. He said he couldn't explain it as a child, so he turned it into ambition. He decided he would become a man no one could dismiss, and somewhere along the way, he started associating my quietness with weakness, my tiredness with failure, my simplicity with something he needed to escape. Hearing that hurt. It would have hurt no matter how gently he said it, but it also helped, because it gave language to something that had always lived between us like a fog. We couldn't clear what we didn't name. I told him things too. I told him I was ashamed sometimes of how emotionally stiff I was when he was little. I told him I thought if I allowed myself to fall apart after his mother left, we'd both drown, so I built a wall inside myself and lived behind it. I told him I didn't know the wall will also block the warmth he needed. That confession was hard for me, because fathers like me aren't trained to speak like that. But it mattered. It turned our relationship from accusation to shared human truth. Two people trying to survive the same abandonment in different ways. One night, months later, Evan invited me over to his house for dinner. Not a party, just dinner. No guests, no Gerald, no applause. He cooked, awkwardly, and the food wasn't great, but I didn't care. We sat at his table, and he said, I took the photo down. I didn't know what he meant at first. Then he gestured towards a shelf where a framed picture had been. A picture from the housewarming, him and Gerald laughing with their glasses raised. Evan said, I couldn't look at it. Then he added, I didn't want you to come here and feel like this house was built on disrespect. I didn't know what to say, because that was the kind of consideration I had wanted for years without knowing how to ask for it. So I said the only honest thing I could. Thank you. And I meant it. Not because it erased the toast, because it showed me Evan was doing real repair, not just feeling guilty in private. There was one more moment in the aftermath that I think says everything. It happened about a year later. Evan got promoted again, and his company held a small recognition event. Nothing huge, a few speeches, a few handshakes, a little applause. Evan invited me. I almost didn't go. Part of me still feared public moments with him, feared becoming invisible again, but I went anyway. Evan stood up to speak, and for a second I felt my chest tighten the way it did at the housewarming. Then he did something I didn't expect. He looked
directly at me, held my gaze, and he said, I want to thank my dad. He raised me, and he protected me when I didn't deserve it. He didn't say it like a performance. He said it with a steadiness that told me he understood the weight of what he was repairing. The room clapped, not awkwardly, normally, and I felt something inside me soften that I didn't realize had stayed clenched for so long. Not because I needed public praise, but because public erasure hurts differently than private misunderstanding. A public repair matters too. It doesn't fix everything, but it seals something shut that had been left open in front of witnesses. Evan still carries shame about that toast, I can tell. He jokes about it sometimes, in that self-protective way men joke about the things that still sting. But it doesn't feel like the dominant story between us anymore. The dominant story now is that he woke up before the trap closed, that he asked questions, that he chose truth over pride, even when it made him look foolish in his own mind. That he came back to me, not just for rescue, but for relationship. And me? I learned in the aftermath that fatherhood sometimes means being misunderstood for a long time and still showing up when it matters. That's not romantic, it's just real. I also learned something I wish I'd learned earlier. Silence can keep a child stable in a crisis, but it can also leave a child hungry. I can't redo the early years, but I can speak now. I can tell my son I love him. I can tell him I'm proud of him. I can tell him I'm sorry for what I didn't know how to give. And I can let him tell me the truth of his hunger without turning it into a courtroom where someone has to be the bad one. Because in the end, the aftermath wasn't about Gerald. He was a lesson, a warning, a threat that revealed itself. The real aftermath was about two men, father and son, finally learning how to see each other without the filter of pride. Evan stopped confusing polish with protection. I stopped confusing provision with communication. And slowly, painfully, honestly, we built something new out of what was left. Not a perfect relationship, but a real one.